We've just read Parashat Metzora, and one of the things that I think is rather unfortunate about all the layers of, let's say, Kabbalistic interpretation and whatever else that have piled up on top of some of the ideas connected with Tuma and Tara, with ritual purity and impurity over time, is that, as is often the case, when you get to start making up things that aren't Torah, but handing them off as though they are, and here I'm talking about Kabbalistic things, for example, there's a temptation to use the freedom you have to make up new statements to have what seems like a positive practical consequence, which is to say, there are certain things that people are not supposed to do. And if you tell them new stories about why they shouldn't do them, because there's some spiritual physics that means that it's a bad idea, then maybe they will be afraid to do them. And then they won't do those things. And then you're getting them to behave better. And what could be better than that, right? That's a kind of rationale that's hiding in the deep background of a lot of Kabbalistic, uh, let's say, warnings or stories that are told about certain kinds of activities. And I think that this practice of concocting such tales is quite harmful for various reasons. Perhaps it's hard to say most of all, but certainly not least of all, in instances that have to do with the human body and sexuality. So we have in Parashat Metzora instances that are discussed of different kinds of bodily emissions and how they make one tameh, which is to say, ritually prohibited from approaching the mikdash, going to the temple. And then there's rules described for how to become tahor again, so that you are now whole in yourself, and you can again go to the mikdash. And a number of these different examples involve in one way or another, either with males or with females, the parts of their body that are involved in reproduction and the sort of either malfunctioning of those or things that happen in the due course of, for example, relations between men and women, and then how that, is connects with Tuma and Tara. And the Torah gives us rules about Tuma and Tara, and it doesn't add all sorts of stories about creepy crawlies and sort of spiritual emanations associated with those rules, which are the reasons that you should keep them. And then when you come along to various kinds of Kabbalistically motivated ladder commentaries on these rules, it starts to be that the whole sense of reasons why you would do these things and wouldn't do those things, there's suddenly this whole new set of layers of, like, there's kind of the spiritual physics of, if you behave, in the following way, you engage in this activity that is somehow prohibited and also, involves sexuality in some way, then there are these kind of pollutional emanations that are caused by that, and they're sort of doing creepy crawly scary things in a spiritual space you can't see. And that's really why it's so terrible to do these things. When you fill people's heads with nonsense like this, which unfortunately happens a whole lot under the guise of Torah, it has a really caustic effect on people's attitudes about sexuality, as I think it's clear that the Torah would actually have us have. And moreover, it also totally confuses other issues, because Tuma and Tara are not about spiritual creepy crawlies that are invisible that no one can see. They're about, as we've discussed in previous shiurim, creating sort of green light and red light, like go and stop, for approaching the mikdash in a way that focuses you on things that affect your sense of wholeness and a pureness or completeness in yourself, which is partly about contact with death, but not only. And that in turn is about how you relate to Hashem and whether you can have certain kinds of experiences of his presence or not while you're in a certain kind of mental and physical state. Right? So that's what Tuma and Tara are actually about. And it's terribly confusing, obviously, to have any sort of superstructure of non-Torah based Kabbalistic statements about how Tuma and Tara are linked in turn to the spiritual emanations that are caused by different kinds of events in one's body, some of which are in turn associated with sexuality and therefore also become the explanation for why you shouldn't engage in certain kinds of sexual acts that Chazal or the Torah are prohibiting, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes this whole mess where the imagination of a person who's trying to decide how to act ends up living in this world, this concocted world that has nothing to do with Torah, and where it could lead them to make bad decisions, and certainly could end up giving them all sorts of misguided attitudes and emotional associations with things to do with sexuality. Now, I don't want to go into detail of any of the particular issues that one might point to here in something like Kitzur Shulchan Aruch or whatever else, but because I don't think it's worth anyone's time to go over those things. But I do think it is interesting now to ask, where should we be learning from the Torah itself how it understands what may be good or what may be bad about different things associated with sexuality, in a way where the text focuses us on the right issues so that we'll make better decisions in Avodat Hashem as a result. So there are a lot of ways you could begin to try to answer that question, and we won't do it comprehensively now. But clearly, one place to start is thinking about Gan Eden, right? The Garden of Eden, which even just on its surface, at a level of what you might call pshat, like the simple reading of the text, seems to be about sexuality in part, insofar as the scene as described is you have a male and female human being living together in this garden. We're told they're naked, and we end the story with childbirth and the result of sexuality as we understand the relationship between sexuality and reproduction in human biology. So in between, there is a narrative set of events that we have to understand, but the wrapping of the story, it's about two things in a sense. It's about food and it's about sexuality. And at one level, it makes sense that it's about both because those are the two most basic aspects of our animal nature that we have to rise above and control as human beings in order to seek relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? All mammals, let's say, just to talk about animals that are most similar to us, have hunger for food and also have instincts to reproduce. And human beings are not exceptional in that regard. And what is exceptional about human beings is that whereas all other animals are going to make their decisions just based on kind of a collision between different forces of instinct that are driving them in this direction or in that direction because they're scared or because they're hungry or because they want to mate or anything else. But in the case of people, we're expected by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to take stock of all of those inclinations we may have and then say, okay, but what's the right thing for me to do? Like, what are the rules that Hashem has given to me? What may I do? What may I not do? What should I do? What's the right thing to do? And to try to make some kind of synthesis between all of those inclinations on the one hand and a set of rules that are, governing your behavior. So it's not surprising that Gan Eden, as the kind of first story about people in the Torah, starts off there because food and sexuality are so deeply ingrained and basic to our existence as humans, insofar as we have a whole lot in common with animals. that you need to deal with them. They need to be there on the surface. It's like it's the way you start off. If you're going to introduce the human being and the challenges the human being faces, then it's going to be about these most basic elements, and everything is going to be built on top of that foundation. So, as we know, the story in Garden of Eden, it's about food, and implicitly and from start to finish, with this sort of atmosphere running all the way through, it's also about sexuality and reproduction. It's about food because it's about the fruit, and these fruits you can eat, and this fruit you cannot eat, and the problem of whether or not someone eats this fruit. And then at the collision point of those different elements, it's also about divine command. It's about the idea that Hashem has expectations of us, and how we navigate those expectations while wrestling with our hungers or appetites of various kinds. But with all that being said, and I'm not sure I'm going to talk about anything that isn't obvious enough that someone else hasn't said it in some form, but I think maybe there's an opportunity to articulate a few points about how different things connect together somewhat more succinctly than at least I was aware of before. There's still the question of, okay, what is the commentary of this story about those subjects? And in particular, especially, if we're talking the difference between food and sexuality here, I would go a step further and maybe say the commentary about food is kind of basic. Well, I wouldn't want to say basic, but that there are different ways that people can subsist. They can eat fruits that they pick from trees, or they can eat bread that they make from grain that they farm through significant effort and ingenuity. And you see kind of a transition from one of those things to the other over the course of what happens in Gan Eden. And so there's a deeper structure underneath that, but there is a surface level where you can say, I get the point of what is being talked about here as far as food. When it comes to sexuality, it's less clear because the text is less explicit about that. Exactly what was possible or wasn't before they eat the fruit, and then what becomes possible afterwards. Like, is it the case that eating the fruit made it the case that now there is childbirth, but before there wasn't? Or is eating the fruit the beginning of activities that can produce children? In other words, was there no sexuality before the eating of the fruit? Like, where does it all enter into the story, and how do we identify that? So there may be different ways of trying to answer this, but I think that there's another question we can ask that maybe frames the opportunity we'll have here to see how a few different pieces fit together, which is that if we're going to say that there's some kind of basic lesson about the human condition and the inseparability of sexuality from the human condition in this piece of the Torah, when we first read it, so to speak, as kids, or as first-time readers who are not kind of looking very carefully into the backstory, what's a little odd about it is that there is a lot of focus on the woman, who eventually is named Chava, but at the time is called the woman, Aisha. There's a lot of focus on her and her choices, her dialogue with this, tempting reptile, the Nachash, the serpent, and almost as sort of an afterthought. Well, once she's eaten from the fruit, she gives some to her husband too, and he eats it, and then also he gets, put on trial, so to speak, where Hakadosh Baruch Hu was saying, what did you do? I told you not to eat this, etc. But he's absent seemingly from the story at the crucial moment where she makes this decision to eat the fruit. And that doesn't make sense if what the story is about at some level is some kind of mistake in our morality with respect to sexuality. So just to put more cards on the table, I think one way we can look at this is to say the idea of fruit and food and hunger one of the things that the text is going to do is it's going to use that as a way of talking about a different kind of hunger that people have, which is like the libido, the sort of the instinctive drive to reproduce, like the desire for carnal experience, for sexual contact, right? You can think of that to some degree, you can analogize it to something that we hunger for in the sense that food is something that we both have a kind of need for, but also that it produces enjoyment beyond the basic need that we have, and that we're sort of discriminating about it in some way, that we prefer this over that. And Chazal, you look at the way the sages talk about marital relations, and they sometimes talk about it as though it's sort of a meal. There's this continuing theme of the idea of sexuality as being analogized to a meal that you can consume and enjoy and benefit from, but also maybe have kind of taste for and preference in as a result, that you prefer this fruit to that fruit, so to speak. And so if that's the case, then it's da'ath tov v'ra, right? The tree of da'at tov v'ra, meaning, and now you have to decide how to translate that. I'm going to say good and bad knowledge. Okay, but carnal knowledge, because the direction we want to go is when we actually hear it described that Adam produces a child with his wife, the act of conceiving that child is called da'at. It's, the verb that's used is yada, right? And he knew his wife. And you could say that's a sort of euphemistic language that Torah employs, but at some level, it's also very honest language because it's knowledge, but it's knowledge from carnal experience. So the point is that there's a kind of an intimacy of a physical nature that produces knowledge of what it's like to sort of be that close and that connected that wasn't there before. And so that knowledge is, in the language of the Torah, very connected with the reproductive act. And if that's the case, then da'at, tov v'ra, is now we're talking about carnal knowledge, perhaps. And then is it good or is it bad? Well, it's saying it's good and bad, right? So you can complicate what tov and ra mean, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say they just mean good and bad. So it's not about knowledge of good and evil necessarily. In this case, where the way we're reading it is it's a tree of good and bad carnal knowledge. And it has a fruit, and you can eat from that fruit or you cannot eat from that fruit. And the idea is there that it really is explicitly taking this idea of the notion of sexual encounter and analogizing it to a fruit that can be eaten. So it is like very much in line with this theme we mentioned from Chazal, that they're really getting probably from this point in the text and carrying forward into the whole tradition of marital relations between a man and a woman, let's say, as being like a meal. And a meal with a sort of a taste that you can like and that you can desire, that you can hunger for, all of those things. So if that's the case, then no, I still haven't gotten to what is the question? What's the puzzle question? The puzzle question is this: if that's true, if we're going to read this and say, okay, actually, this whole story is maybe a commentary on how sexuality is woven into the human condition and making some thoughtful comments on that. If that's the case, why is it that the man is pushed so far into the background as far as the issue specifically of making a bad decision, right? Making a sinful decision, right? Violating the command of HaKadosh Baruch Hu because of some desire that you have, right? The way we read the story, we say, well, somehow Adam or Ha'adam disappears from view. And while he's off the scene, you have Hava or you have Haisha, the woman. She talks to the serpent, and she ends up not being able to resist some desire that she has to eat this fruit. So she eats it, and then she gives it to him. You don't even really know if he knows what he's eating at the time. Afterwards, he just kind of blames her. But if the story is, okay, so this is all, we're reading it allegorically, this fruit is the desirable kind of consumable aspect of the experience of sexuality. And in the course of eating this fruit, which was initially forbidden, which we'll have to look at carefully, the woman is the one who makes the primary mistake in being overcome by some desire. And then the man is maybe tricked or whatever, and you don't even really know what the circumstances are of his decision. Does that sound right? Does it sound right that if we're talking about all aspects of the human condition and we're going to make one statement about this that is foundational to the rest of what our understanding is going to be in Tanakh and Torah, whatever, that we say, yeah, the major reason that you're going to see human beings making terrible decisions where they break Hashem's rules and they do the wrong thing because they were overcome by some desire for sexual encounter, that's definitely going to be just because women make that mistake sometimes, and then they end up sort of ensnaring men um, in the midst of their mistake. Does that sound right? Like, I don't want to push this to the other extreme, and we'll talk about how it is legitimate that in this text, there's an aspect of it that is about how the woman can play a problematic role. But what kind of a faithful representation of human sexuality would it be if you said, if you erased or you disappeared or you sort of pushed to the background the well understood fact that male desire for sexual encounter is a huge driving force behind a lot of chet, right? A lot of mistake, a lot of misdeed, a lot of breaking of Hashem's laws. It is an obvious point about archetypal male and female roles in this kind of an encounter that it's quite common or typical for males to be more eager and less interested in thinking about all the consequences in advance and all of these things. And that's not to say that it can never be the reverse or it's always one way. But the idea that somehow you're going to make some statement for all the ages about the essence of like what our greatest challenge is in human sexuality as part of the human condition, and we're just going to sort of hide from view the idea that men do things like, become serial rapists, or they do things like become warlords who conquer whole countries so that they can expand their endless harem that they're amassing, like Genghis Khan or Ahasuerus or whatever else. Um, those are things that we know men do, and they do lots of other things as well, as a result of a very rapacious, typical appetite for sexual encounter. And if that's the case, that needs to be there somewhere. It needs to be reflected in the text. But where is it? We just said that Adam is not on the scene. And that's where we have to go and start thinking, okay, so Adam is not on the scene. Who is on the scene? Well, Chava, the woman, or the Isha, and obviously the Nachash, the serpent, right? So this serpent who's on the scene, what is he? Who is he? And there is where you start to get an idea from all of the context that we just gave for this. You say, okay, well, first of all, usually serpents don't talk. Second of all, if it's the case that the fruit of Etz Da'at Toveran, this theory of the case that we're putting forward, the fruit is like eating the fruit is equivalent in a sense to partaking of the sexual act. then what is the role of the Nachash here? The Nachash is somehow the personality that's trying to persuade the woman to make the mistake. And, Chazal add to this um, that the Nachash had arms and legs and was hoping to become a mate for the woman instead of Adam, which is really telegraphing, the place that we're going here, which is that we should think of this word Nachash for this purpose here as really having to do with a male human being, right? Uh, the reason that it's being called a Nachash could be various things. First of all, because then it can be Hayat Sadeh in the language of the text, a beast of the field. It's emphasizing the animal nature. Also, serpents lose their skin, they change their skin. So it's emphasizing the idea of costume change, right? Like that Adam is the man in the story, but we need a different man. And so suddenly it's a shift in identity. You change the clothing or the skin, so to speak. And now you're talking about a new personality in the story. But really, in some sense, we're still talking about the man because there has to be one man and one woman in the story. Beyond that, we know that the Torah itself describes a very interesting play on words that is always a bit puzzling. Describes the Nachash as being the cleverest beast of the field. והנחש היה ערום מכל חיית השדה, אשר עשה אדוני אלוהים. ויאמר אל האישה, אף כי אמר אלוהים, לא תאכלו מכל עץ הגן. Now the serpent was more crafty or subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, has God said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? But this word arum, which means crafty and subtle, well, if we go to the previous pasuk, وَيِهْيُوا شْنِهِمْ عَرُمِيم هَأَدَامُ وَإِشْتُهُ وَلَا يَتْبَشَّشُوا. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. So somehow the cleverness of the serpent is being emphasized as being parallel to some notion of nakedness. Nakedness also, in the context of a man and woman being naked together. So you pile all of those things on top of each other, and you add, in addition, that the Nachash, not accidentally perhaps, is the animal that most resembles the male organ for sexual reproduction. And I think what you have is a substantial amount of evidence that it's possible to read this as saying, look, we are going to take this one man and we're going to split him into two different identities that he needs to have in different parts of the story. The Nachash represents the capacity of the male in the story to be the one applying the pressure, the one trying to bring about the eating of the fruit, right? That it makes sense suddenly, in light of everything we were saying before, but archetypes of male and female behavior, it makes sense that if this story is about making the mistake of violating the divine command because someone couldn't resist partaking of some kind of forbidden sexual experience, then it should be the male libido that is the strongest driving force in that equation, because that's archetypally and typically going to be the case. That doesn't mean it's always the case, and there can be all sorts of different, individuals in the world, but we're talking in archetypes here. We're talking about all the stories of human beings written throughout the ages. What are they going to be sort of measured against? It should be measured against the male desire for sexual encounter being the overpowering and rapacious one, the one that's more beastly, the one that sometimes does make men into rapists, right? That can be very insatiable and that can be very implacable and all of these things. And so now it makes sense that the Nachash is that aspect of the male. And he's the one who's applying the pressure on the female to say, look, maybe actually, this is okay. What do you think? And suddenly it's not so much only the fault of the woman that this thing happens, right? She also makes a mistake. Like she's also made b'tzelem Elohim and accountable for her actions and her choices in her own right. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu can hold her to account as well for her choice. But she's also, to some degree, making her choice, I don't want to say under duress, but under pressure, and where the persuasion is coming from perhaps the person who also told her about the divine command in the first place. And here's where it gets a little confusing, because this is why the text, I think, in this beautiful way operates in this manner to kind of split you out into two different scenarios, because you need to really be able to see the possibility of both kind of mistake, right? One kind of mistake is, you see the first part, the Nachash, who is the sort of the man who's demanding the transgression because of his hunger, right? That he's going to the woman, applying the pressure, and with the pressure on, she ends up being persuaded, because at the end of the day, she has her own desires for this to happen, and so it happens, right? Then there's the second sort of, you do like a frame shift and go over and say, okay, the woman, she was talking to who knows what. She was talking to herself. She was talking to a reptile hanging from a tree. In any case, now she made the mistake, and she communicates that mistake to her husband, right? Not to a snake, but to a man in the picture who has now been separated from this notion of he's the one applying the pressure, because that also can happen, right? There is another aspect of this, which is the possibility that the woman can act as the temptress, so to speak, right? It can be that there is a forbidden encounter, and the reason the man ends up engaging in it is because the fruit, so to speak, is being offered to him by the woman in a way that makes it irresistible, and so he, partakes of the same meal. We're talking in terms of carrying forward this idea that this fruit from this tree is representing this kind of encounter. And that has to be there in the text also, because as much as Tanakh understands that men can be the sort of warlord, Achashverosh kind of figure, or can be the rapist like Shem, in the case of Dinah, right? We see those explicitly in Tanakh. It's also the case that sometimes you can have the idea of the Zonah, or you can have the idea of the Noefet, right? Like an adulteress or a prostitute who, in one way or another, can, people make their choices and their decisions in individual cases for all sorts of reasons, but Tanakh understands the possibility that there is a woman who will make the wrong choice and also perhaps tempt a man into making the wrong choice because of how it benefits her, right? It's, you see examples described like this in Tanakh, where a woman is married to Reuven, but she wants attention, forbidden attention from Shimon, because Shimon will shower her with gifts and feed her or whatever else. So it becomes very much an issue of needing to represent both kind of possible failure modes. And you can't do that, is the point, in one story. If there were one story about one man and one woman, the dynamics mix together and you kind of don't know whose fault it is entirely, right? Like if someone who's 25% a rapist comes into a situation where, on the other hand, you're dealing with a sort of unscrupulous temptress in 33%, a ratio, then when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is calling them to account at the end, whoever made what choice is very hard to disentangle in terms of how you're trying to, judge them and say, oh, this transgression is the result of the mistake of this person, or result of the intentional sin of this person. But once you get to split them apart, you can see the extremes laid out for you. It can be the case that this kind of thing happens because the male is the beastly source of high pressure, and that hunger, or that desire, right? Like the ultimate punishment for the serpent, the Nahash, is al gichoncha telech, and you'll crawl on your belly and you'll eat the dust of the earth. there's this sense of insatiable hunger. A snake that crawls on its belly and just always has its mouth to the ground and is always eating the dust of the earth. Um, and there's an evocation of animal hunger that can never be satisfied, right? That can be the reason that people do the wrong thing with regard to sexual encounter and they violate the divine command. But in another version, it can be that a man would otherwise have been trying to do the right thing, but the temptation to do the wrong thing was too great when it was presented to him by a woman who decided that she wanted him to join her in the mistake, right? Those are two distinct, essential elements to an understanding of the dyad of male and female in sexuality and in the human condition. And they're both there in this one text in the Torah. Once you recognize how to split things apart in the right way. And I think many have before observed the possibility of attributing this kind of quality to the Nachash. But I think that it certainly has helped me to understand what's going on there in the text better, to try to lay things out this precisely in terms of the correspondence of different pieces. So I think the last thing we just now have to ask is, what was HaKadosh Baruch Hu thinking that at the beginning of the story, if the fruit indeed represents sexuality, right, then what we're saying is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's initial command was, don't eat this fruit. And that's saying, don't have sexuality be part of the human condition. So are we supposed to infer from that we shouldn't be doing this, and in some ideal world, this wouldn't be part of who we are? That seems to leave us in this sort of painful position of everyone needing to do something that we are always telling ourselves HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want us to do. But on the other hand, it isn't in practice how things play out, right? Like there is no mitzvah today that we know of where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to all of humanity, there's this one fruit and you can't eat from it, right? So we don't have the idea that the mitzvah not to eat it's dat Torah still holds. And so this is actually somehow about demonstrating the ways things needed to be, right? The same way you have with like the flood, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world to develop a civilization to the point where there has to be a mabul in the Torah's understanding, right? There has to be that you have a clean slate, you wipe out most of humanity because they're so wicked. And you could say, well, why not just make Noach first? Why would you make people who are going to become the wicked generation when you could just have the first person be Noach, since you're HaKadosh Baruch Hu and you can set things going? Part of the point is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to show you how things could have been so that you see the failure modes and what there was, and you understand why it's different than that, right? That you might have thought we could have things be this way, but no, it turns out that when they are this way, they go off the rails in the following fashion, and therefore, we have to have a new start, a fresh start, and based on a different covenant, based on new rules, etc. And I think there's a similar thing going on here. This is really the sort of first instance of it, where we say that the end of the story in Gan Eden is the expulsion from Eden, and the expulsion to do what? To go work the land and to go create life, right? Hava, or Hawa, is named what she is named because she's going to be Em Kol Hai. That's the mother of all life. She becomes the bearer of children through the end of the story. And we think of it as like, oh, she's being punished sort of because she's being told she's going to have painful birth pangs. But at the end of the day, it's a great bracha to become a mother who can give birth to children as the Torah understands it. And then Adam, similarly, it's, Beze'ata pecha tochal lechem. So you're going to eat bread by the sweat of your brow. He's going to have to do a lot of hard work, but he's going to eat bread, which is interestingly not eating fruit, right? Eating fruit is like straight off the tree, but eating bread, it's like you made it and you control it. And there's this satisfaction of creating it. And it's maybe more filling, literally satisfying, like satiating than eating a piece of fruit. And so there's a bracha in there, there's a blessing, but there's also a kind of life's going to be hard, both for the man and for the woman. And I think the point is, if we know that those are the end points of the story, then going back to the beginning, you could say, this is why it doesn't make sense for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to forbid sexuality, so to speak, or remove it from the equation. But it's also why you can't have it be on its own, like why it has to have consequences, right? In our understanding of the real world and how it works, sexuality is connected with childbirth, and therefore it's also connected with economics, right? And that's much more the case when you go all the way to the basics of the human condition, and you're not living in this high-tech, affluent 21st century society. Although these things are still very relevant in their own way, as we'll discuss. The basics are sexuality leads to the creation of new life, and that's dangerous and painful for the woman. And there's a responsibility to provide for the flourishing of that life. And that's hard work and heavy responsibility for the man, right? The basics of the marriage contract, the man needs to protect and provide for the woman who's going to be bearing his children. And so he needs to figure out how to generate wealth and food. And she needs to face the ordeals and the tribulations of bringing life into this world. And of course, you can make it more complicated, and the woman can also, farm, and the man can help in the nurturing and raising of children, et cetera, et cetera. But the basic, skeleton of the human condition is what the text is recognizing there. And to the degree that that's the case, what we're seeing in this notion of the fruit as being about kind of like sexuality as a meal, right? The focus is on, this is something I have desire to consume. It's like, it's a thing that produces hunger in me, and I can satiate that hunger through an act, right? That's how we relate to a piece of fruit. You can relate also to sexuality that way. And the problem the text is telling us with that is that it's not balanced out. Right? And what's going to happen is, if you imagine a world where you don't need to worry about childbirth and you don't need to worry about providing for children, you just are living in this paradise where your food is provided, you haven't a care or a worry in the world. And then there's this one thing you can do, which is sexuality, which is represented by this one fruit. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, well, you can do that, but I'm going to forbid it, right? And you have everything else you need and you want, but it's just that there's this one fruit that actually you have a very powerful hunger for. You have a very strong inclination to consume it as a meal and to derive all of the enjoyment that one can derive from that. But I'm going to say, look, I've given you everything else. Can you please, just as a token gesture to show, and this is, I know, cribbing an idea from Shiurim by Rabbi David Foreman about Gan Eden, can you just have one thing that you set aside where you say, because I need to acknowledge my creator who made me, I'm going to have this one law where I'm not going to engage in this one activity that I would enjoy, right? The text is saying to us, look, that's not going to work. This desire, this potential for enjoyment, and this desire that we have is so great that if you just had that as though it were, so to speak, a fruit among many to be enjoyed and consumed, then you will not be able to resist transgressing the divine command, even when there's no other reason to do that, right? You're not living in some condition of hardship and constraint. You have a completely worked out, perfectly stable, safe, well-nourished, happy life. And all that's being asked of you is celibacy. And again, we're talking about archetypes of the human condition, not strange things that individuals can impose on themselves, because obviously some manage to do that. One might argue in foolhardy fashion, but in any case, just take this one thing and don't do it as a sign to Hashem that you're going to, remember him and be grateful. This one rule, just keep this one rule, this one mitzvah that comes to you. And sorry, doesn't work. People can't do that, right? People will violate a divine command that comes directly to them from HaKadosh Baruch Hu because of the power of this desire that they have. And if that's the case, then now what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying is, then we need to do something else with this, right? It can't be that this is just one among many fruits that you could enjoy as a snack, so to speak. It has to be that there are consequences, that there are difficult associations with this particular experience, right? That it's not just that you enjoy yourself and you're done, but that afterwards, the woman has a chance of dying in childbirth, or even, if she doesn't, that it's going to be very difficult and painful and lengthy and all of that. And that the man is going to have all these responsibilities that are associated with continuing the nurturing of that life after it comes into the world. And obviously, again, that's an ideal that the Torah is setting out for us, and people can try different things. They can walk out on the lives that they create and, do terrible things like that. But the point is that this ends up getting written into our emotional deep structure as well. So when we're thinking in terms of biology, when we're thinking in terms of instinct and everything else and how we're made, there's no way around the complexity of sexual encounter for people because of all the backstory involving reproduction that it's associated with. And what Gan Eden is trying to show us is that, so to speak, by design, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants that to be the case. He wants it to be the case that we can't simply relate to sexuality as a snack among many others that we could choose from a menu. And that's where I think we can close this off and just say that is a particularly interesting statement to bring into the present era, because the present era is highly technologically sophisticated, and it's already been the case that methods of birth control have existed for a long time. But beyond that, we're headed off an even steeper cliff as a species with the development of virtual reality technologies and everything else, where people are developing the capacity to attempt using technology to try to turn sexuality into a snack for an individual to choose from a menu that doesn't even need to involve another real human being. And I think the terrifying fact of that is that puts, again, we're talking in archetypes, individuals are different, but it puts the human being in a situation where they are that case that the text considers before, so to speak, the advent of childbirth and responsibility for the nurturing of life, where you just have the fruit on the tree. And what the lesson there was, again, is if it's made that easy and if it's made that uncomplicated, then the addictive power of that instinct within human beings can put people into a state where they simply will violate any divine command in order to stay um, in a position of being able to access that particular kind of meal, that particular kind of experience. Uh, Now, in the present day, it's not the case that all of humankind are to the same degree rushing to plug themselves into a virtual reality space that can addict them to digitally simulated sexual experiences, obviously. But there's a huge portion of the developed world that at the moment doesn't have a language for explaining what would be wrong with that, right? Especially in like the last century, there's been an assiduous step-by-step kind of chipping away at the notion that engaging in such activities purely for one's own enjoyment, that there should be anything worrying or troubling about that. If there's any problem with it. And going back to what we started off in the beginning, I think that one has to give credit where it's due and say there was such a thick layer of spooky, mystical nonsense, whether in the Jewish world or the Christian world or the Islamic world or anywhere else, spooky, mystical nonsense trying to scare people away from sexuality that did not come from Torah, that it was correct to reject and deride at some level, that probably, many people who were very well intentioned were saying, look, it turns out like we had all of these kind of superstitious or other kind of ways of scaring ourselves into being very conservative about sexual activity in certain ways. And now, we figured out that a lot of that is just pseudoscientific nonsense or superstition or whatever else, and we can leave it by the wayside. But the modern developed, hyper-technologized West is now more in the position of just saying, there is nothing wrong with a mode of self-gratification where the, any degree of, intensification of engagement through technology or whatever else is being pursued. What's wrong with that? It's not hurting anyone, so it can't be wrong, right? And what the Torah very subtly is laying out for us here is it is both acknowledging that there's a problem with trying to forbid the sexual impulse, because the story at some level kind of begins with that and demonstrates the failure of a simple prohibition, so that by the end we have the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, no, look, this can be part of a way that I give you bracha, that I can bless you, that I've actually created you this way so that this is part of what you can partake of in the world. And insofar as it is that, within that context, it can be a good thing and it can be thought of as a gift from the creator, and it doesn't have to be thought of in any sort of negative association. But it needs to be bounded and it needs to be attached and balanced. It needs to be attached to and balanced by these associations that really carry the weight of life and death, right? Pregnancy and childbirth and responsibility for life and, for feeding life so that it doesn't starve and everything else. And when you make that separation and you pry away the sense, which you never really can do completely, but you can delude yourself with pictures and simulate the prying away of that responsibility, you can create a situation then where a lot of people will experience themselves to be in this state of only having to focus on the fruit aspect. This is a meal that I want, that I can just reach out and have, and it's permitted to me, and it's available, and I don't have to stop, and I don't have to limit, and I'm not bounded in any way. And what we're seeing from the text is that is the dangerous situation. That's the situation where HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want that either. He ultimately doesn't want to prohibit sexuality, but it's also the case that if sexuality is divorced from those balancing responsibilities and sort of the gravity of matters of life and death, that it becomes a drug or an irresistible temptation to transgress, and insofar as it becomes a reason you would take a divine command given directly to you and just ignore it because a more powerful force in you is causing you to focus on your hunger to the exclusion of anything else. So, I'm not entirely clear where that leads or what it means for the present day, other than to say that it is certainly the case that the whole developed world is at a precipice in many respects, but this one is quite a serious one insofar as we're talking about the creation of technologies that can addict people to living in fantasy worlds, and sexuality is going to be a part of how that is made addictive by the purveyors of these opportunities. And suddenly, those societies or segments of society that have already imposed on themselves rules about sexuality that others call arbitrary and useless because they don't prevent harm, so what's the point of them? Those sectors of society or those societies that already are bounding their actions and their choices within frameworks that take the hunger for sexual experience and limit it and channel it, they're going to be in a much better position to avoid the destructive effects of what will obviously be very addictive new technologies that are going to be very aggressively marketed to everyone very soon.